Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth and final class in the third semester of the Emerald Choral Academy. My name is Scott Kovacs, and I'm the Executive Director of the Emerald Ensemble, a professional choir based in Seattle. The Emerald Choral Academy is a series of interactive webinars during which our area's leading professional choristers reveal their personal tricks of the trade to community singers. These webinars are then made available freely to singers across the world via YouTube. This presentation is funded in part by a grant from the Washington State Arts Commission, in addition to the National Endowment for the Arts, for Culture, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and many generous donors. We encourage anyone participating or viewing this webinar to make a donation as you are able at emeraldensemble.org. We'll drop some links in the chat in just a moment. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our mailing list to hear about future sessions of the Academy and the other activities of the Emerald Ensemble. This webinar is being recorded. By participating, you are granting the Emerald Ensemble permission to share your contribution. Your microphones and cameras will remain off for the duration of the presentation. You can ask questions to the presenter by typing into the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. Periodically, we'll interject to field your questions. Today's session is being led by one of the Seattle region's leading choral conductors who has had an active role in shaping the musical landscape we all enjoy. Dr. Gary D. Cannon is artistic director of no less than 3 choral ensembles, the Vashon Island Chorale, Cascadian Chorale, and of course, the Emerald Ensemble. In addition to his conducting responsibilities, he is a virtuosic author of program notes and frequently gives pre-concert lectures for the Seattle Symphony. Gary's also a pretty fine tenor and has sung professionally throughout the region, both as a choralist and soloist. Importantly, Gary is also an editor, composer, and arranger who has produced editions and reorchestrations for choral ensembles throughout the region, bringing his expertise to our subject for today. And so, without any further ado, here to discuss editions, what they do and what they don't, is my friend and colleague, Gary Cannon. Gary?
Thank you. I'll supply plenty of adieu as the time progresses. I was actually thinking about something that Scott touched on there, of the various hats that I wear in music and the levels that I enjoy them the most. I decided it was conducting performances, researching and writing about music, and then making new editions was right there. If I had enough time, I would make a new edition of every single piece that I conducted, because why not, right? Just to make sure it's all clear. Let's go into I'm going to share screen. Somebody let me know if I mess it up. I think I need to now click a button or something. All right, that should do it. Yes, there's me. Oh, I forgot to put an email address or something, but you're welcome to contact me at gary@emeraldensemble.org, and I have a few other addresses which you're welcome to. What editions, what they do and what they don't. Today, my purpose, if I get this thing working right, why is that not working? There we go. Is as follows. My goal is to introduce you firstly to different types of scores that exist, different types of editions. That means editorial styles, the different formats you may find, as well as the types of scholarship. I prefer that rather than saying levels of scholarship, because different scores have their different purposes. And along the way, I'll sprinkle in some advice of variables to be aware of, so that as you encounter these different kinds of scores, these kinds of editions, you can make them musical when you're singing through them the very first time, ideally. My comments are geared to community singers rather than conductors who are looking for which editions to choose, or kind of scholars who might be looking for advice on how to go about making editions. So be aware of that. All YouTubes everywhere. I do not intend to endorse any particular publishers or any forums where you may find editions. I will speak about certain publishers periodically, but I can start by saying that all of these different publishers have strengths and have reasons to choose their scores based on your own variables. And I'm not going to talk about how to go about reading different editions of a score in particular. I'll be looking at more what it is you see and how to interpret that into the knowledge you already have as a musician reading a score. So I'm going to talk about why did that not go over automatically? I thought I was supposed to be able to hit that button. There we go. We'll talk about 3 different types of scores, the formats that you may encounter or should be aware of at the very least. The first is the full score, also called the orchestral score, or here's an example of a full score of Walton's Belshazzar's Feast. And I'll give examples of that later. Sometimes publishers will reprint that as what's called a study score, rather smaller. We'll talk about some of the differences there too. And then every once in a while, if you're very lucky, especially if it's a public domain work, you'll find a miniature score. Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet, in this case, is rather thick for being miniature, but it is very miniature on the side, on the inside. Trying to read the small type can be challenging. Very few conductors work regularly off of miniature scores, but study scores are pretty commonly used. These scores allegedly contain all of the information that is needed for a performance of music. There are occasionally little things that will be only in the instrumental parts, but allegedly everything that's needed is there. A modern orchestral choral score is probably going to have 25 or 30 different staves on a page. So you're used to reading probably 4 parts and then the piano underneath it. But in this case, the score has 30 individual lines or more in some cases. Every once in a while, if a particular instrument is not being used, then that line will just not appear. So the conductor needs to have all that in track. The instruments are always listed almost always listed in a specific order, a traditional order. Woodwinds, brass, and each of those has specific orders. Percussion, special instruments like piano or harp or organ or guitar or celesta, and then soloists, and then the chorus, and then strings below. This can change slightly based on the format, but chances are this is the case. So that's what your conductor is looking at. Here's an example, which the purpose is not for you to be able to read all of that. The purpose is to overwhelm you by all those variables. This is from Samuel Barber's Prayers of Kierkegaard. This is 1 page of the conductor's score. These 3 measures that are there take about 5 seconds of music. This is an extreme example, but it's a great example, nevertheless, of what the full score looks like. You generally won't have to encounter that, but it's important that you know that's what the conductor is looking at. That's the edition that they see. And it might be several hundred pages that look like the one that you have there. The second format of score, which is what you encounter the most, I'm sure, is called the vocal score. It's often called the piano vocal score, and that is because its original intent was more, or at least as much, for the rehearsal pianist as it was for the singers. Therefore, the piano part is typically rather larger. The note heads are rather larger than those in the choral parts. You can look through your own vocal scores and discover that for yourself. Vocal scores are in all sorts of paper sizes, just like full scores. We often refer to something as the octavo, and wouldn't you believe it, of all the scores I have here sitting here ready, I don't have a single octavo. This is octavo size, though it's a thicker booklet. This is the Duraflay Requiem choral part. The term octavo originally came about from the old paper format where it was the size of the paper that was needed, that if you folded it, so you would have 16 pages of music on 1 sheet of paper. Nowadays, that tends to be about 6.5 inches by 10.5 inches. That's technically how octavo came about. The vocal scores often nowadays are at 8.5 by 11, so that anybody can print them at home. This is especially true for self-published scores, which I'll talk about as a special case later. The advantage of that larger size is that you get a little more music per page, usually, and therefore you might get fewer pages. This can save in money, and let's face it, choirs are also businesses with budgets and bottom lines to meet. And it also saves on a singer's arm strain, especially if you've got tons and tons of these octavos in your folder. You know what it's like for that to wear down. Fewer pages means less, fewer pounds, literally, that you're holding. One of the reasons I talked about the full score is because it's still relevant to your vocal score. And sometimes there are discrepancies between them, which can be very fun to encounter. The advice that I give you, and again, in making sure that when you're given a score, you're able to be musical about it, is that the score in your hand is right until you're notified otherwise by your conductor or section leader or comparable authority. It's okay to trust the score that you have in your hand, even if you think the orchestral score has something different. If you look up the orchestral score online and find, well, that's different than my vocal score, forget what you find online, use what you have, and let your choral leadership determine the other differences. Now, that said, follow your choir's protocols for asking questions, whether it be during rehearsal or after rehearsal or via email or what have you. That's appropriate, of course, but your default should be to use what you have. I showed earlier a page of Barber's Prayers of Kierkegaard. The reason I chose that is because when I prepared the chorus for it some years ago, I discovered that every page that I looked at least had some major or minor discrepancy between the full score and the vocal score. I started making a list and was astonished. Usually they were things like where dynamics would start or stop changes, certain indications of markings like articulation. Sometimes there were errors in the vocal score about instrumental cues saying this, the vocal score would say this is played by cello when actually it's played by trombones, which can be unfortunate if you're listening for it in a particular sonority. Sometimes slurs are missing or other indications, or the text would be slightly different. A word like givest rather than giveth. I think that was the specific one example. Punctuation might be different, which influences how you phrase. So if the conductor sees the punctuation in one style, is thinking you're phrasing it in a way, and you have it in a different format, then that can affect things in very real terms, in audible terms. Here is an example. The top half is just the choral parts from the very same pages that I showed you earlier from the Barber. And below that is the vocal score, the piano vocal score for those same three measures. And they're divided over two systems, which is why you see kind of a break there. But I put them as one. First of all, pity the poor pianist who has grown an additional arm, as you can see, sometimes some of these scores exist, and sometimes it's just for reference for the chorus, but sometimes they would expect you to be able to play this in a concert perhaps and have the page turner be a competent pianist to come in with the third hand. I've seen that done. It's very, very rare these days though. But there are actual differences. There are, on these three bars, there are at least three differences between the full score and the choral lines of the vocal score. I'm tempted to say that, turn this into a children's exercise. Can you find them all? But I won't, I'll tell you. One is in the alto part. Let's see, I hope that you're seeing my little thing go around. The alto part in the full score, very nice. And in the vocal score, it has this courtesy accidental of an E natural. Strictly speaking, does a conductor need to see that? No, because they're not reading along a full line, whereas the alto will need that reminder that from the harmony before it, they need to know that. But it's kind of helpful for a conductor to also know what it is the singer is looking at. The most obvious difference in these pages, you'll notice that all four choral parts in the vocal score are marked individually with crescendos. All four of them are marked individually. This is an important idea that is completely absent in the vocal score. And then lastly, you notice in the last syllable, as it were, the last phoneme of at the end of the word unchanging, they're given this particular style of articulation mark, the caret above. And here in the vocal score, it became instead the traditional marcato marking. And I, at least as a singer, I sing those differently. Ding might be the marcato, or ding would have an extra punch to it on the caret style of notation of the marcato. So it does make an audible difference, even though it's a relatively small thing, or seems to be on the surface. What else was I going to say about this this comparison? Nope, that's going to come up later. So there we go. Vocal scores, your friends, even if they're not entirely necessarily accurate, they're what you have. You get to use them, or rather use those as your information until informed otherwise. Oh, that's the other thing. What I was going to say, this crescendo molto, for example, is in the piano part there. Does not. It appears in different instruments at different times over these two bars. Most of them start out with a crescendo poco a poco rather than a molto at this spot. And these two trumpet dyads do not exist in the trumpet part or anywhere in the actual orchestra. They're here simply to reinforce the harmony, so that as your three-armed pianist plays those bits, you'll know that you're what the harmony is, what chord you're singing underneath. But everybody just has different things. They're all on off beats, and the orchestra is really cool here, but it's certainly not that. But look, here's your friendly neighborhood crescendo that didn't get transferred over. Enough on vocal scores and their format. You're familiar a lot with those. You may be less familiar with the choral part. Orchestral instrumentalists are very used to the notion of a part. Choristers are not. The part basically means it's only the information of your line, nothing else. So first violinist, all they're seeing is violin line over and over and over. Instrumentalists are trained in how to see that, how to make that musical, but we as choristers are not. As I said, today it's relatively rare to encounter these. I've been thinking for the last few weeks about what pieces you're likely to encounter in the choral part, and there are really only three, I think, that I can think of off the top of my head that are part of the standard choral repertoire. They are the Poulenc Gloria, the Duruflé Requiem, and Carmina Burana. Yes, there are others out there. I know some of you here have sung the Honegger Christmas Cantata through Vashon Island Chorale, which I've conducted. That was another example. But these three are the big ones, the most common ones nowadays for an American choir. The Poulenc Gloria does have a piano vocal score, but the chorus is extremely small. It's much harder to read the vocal score than the choral part, in the sense of just making out what the pitches are or what the text is. One of the main disadvantage to the choral part, and this is an example from the Poulenc Gloria, is that sometimes you just have to find your pitch out of thin air. What you're seeing here is the beginning of a page, not just a new system, but after a page turn. And at the end of it, the altos alone have been singing. I think they end on an E. I could confirm that, something like that. Then for 3 bars, this little symbol means 3 to them. This 3, by the way, does mean 3 measures, a 4/4. It's rather chromatic, quite beautiful. Then you get 4 bars in a new tempo and a new meter, and you have to hope that what they play in these 4 bars will help the poor sopranos to find their B flat and the poor tenors to find their G. What is it? There's one movement in here that is just something like 2 or 3 bars of nothing, of rest, and then you need to find your pitch. Oh, there's a move. I'm thinking of Duruflé Requiem. The Sanctus gives you 1 bar, and then you have to sing. Fortunately, the orchestra is just noodling around in that key and just in that tonic chord. So long as you can read the key signature, in that case, I think it was an F major, then you know that the orchestra is in F major too, and hooray, hooray, you can be relatively confident finding your F major. The Duraflé Requiem also has a part, as I mentioned. One of its challenges of the piano vocal score is actually the organ vocal score. Duraflé himself made a version of the piece for organ solo with chorus. And so you're holding all those extra pages for extra organ staves. It's still helpful. It's still helpful information, but it's more expensive. It's heavier on your hands. So it's up to your conductor and to a certain extent to your budget to determine which of those to use. Carmina Burana is a very special case. When it was first published, it was premiered in, I want to say, 36, and it wasn't published till the early 40s. It came out originally as the full score. This is the study score rather than the full. It's as large as some fulls. Then also, a few years after, there was the version for piano and percussion, 2 pianos and about 7 percussion players. It's a type of full score, but it was the only thing available for a long time that had the choral parts together with anything instrumental-wise. And that's because the only other things you had access to were these 2 very thin, very slim booklets. This is the soprano and altos on one part. This is the tenors and basses on one part. So this is, in a sense, even more economical than the Poulenc example that you see that at least has all 4 choral parts. In that case, you know when you're in unison with somebody, you know what to fill, what chord you're filling out. But in the case of Carmina Burana, you didn't know that with just these scores. Now it did kind of make sense. The sopranos and altos sing a lot less than the tenors and basses, so their page is their score is, I think, $1.50 or $2 cheaper than the one for the tenors and basses. There was a logic to it when that was initially published. Thank goodness, though, that in 1996 it took that long for Schott, the publisher, to devise this vocal score with a piano reduction. It's quite good, and the choral parts are not written really small because that's an old-fashioned idea. Here, there, it's much better, but it's very expensive. It's like $50 just for this. It's tough for a large choir to afford. So finally, then in 2006, they devised a standard SATB choral part, which works really well for this piece, and it's a very well done addition. So you don't have to worry about a lot of the issues like the example I gave you in the Poulenc Gloria. You may note that all 3 of those are 20th century compositions. That's because pretty much any major public domain work is available now with a piano reduction. Somebody saw these choral parts and said, no, we hate these things. So they made reductions because it was public domain. You didn't need a publisher's imprimatur, a publisher's blessing. That said, though, I hope I've also demonstrated that there are sometimes values to these parts, not just economical or weight-wise, but in the case of what it gives you and what you don't need in some cases. So my advice, if you're given one of these parts, because you may very well, if you sing in a lot of choirs, you probably will sing at least one of those 3 pieces. I have 2 big pieces of advice. One is, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but yes, here comes a cat. Yes, you have to count the rests. When I showed you that Poulenc example that had 3 and then 4 rests, it's your job to do that. You don't just get to follow along the pianist at will. My cat thinks this is a very clever notion, apparently. One hint that I can give you, and these are words you've heard many times, to watch the conductor, but in this case, the conductor really, really is helpful and essential. You can follow along that pattern, then you're all fine. The second is you do have the ability to write in the help that you need. It might just be trombone plays this G, and you have a G later. You're set. You just need to know when that comes into place, or what the orchestral line is, or something like that. And again, it's okay to ask for help. Somebody will have access to the full score and can tell you what might be able to what can be helpful to you. Scott, if we have any questions at this point, this is a logical place to bear.
Nothing's quite come just yet. Your usual thorough and in-depth, relationship to the content has has not yielded any questions at this point. So maybe
Don't
let's
worry.
go to the next
Very good.
spot.
Very good. And here's actually where we really get into the fun stuff, in my opinion, at least. I've talked a little about them, the formats of what you'll see. Now we're going to talk about the work that went in behind it and the significance for you as the reader. There is this book called Behind Bars. Came out in 2011 by the principal editor at Faber Music, which is a fantastic publisher. Her name is Elaine Gould. And it is, what, 800 pages? More than that. Oh, 670 some odd pages of a guide for editors. It's a magnificent book. I bring that up to show just how many rules or traditions or pieces of advice there are to make clear editions of all kinds. And she even talks about specifics for vibraphone, for example, but a lot of it is standard stuff for music publishers, like the relationship of the space between two lines on the staff, to the, so many variables that I didn't even realize had in play, to the thickness of the line. I think that was one. And the thickness of the line in the staff to the thickness of the line in the stem of a quarter note, and they're not necessarily the same. These fantastic bits of minutiae. I have not read that entire book cover to cover, only about half of it, because it was really fun. Now, software, nowadays people use software rather than actual plates like old style printing. Software will do most of that work. But there are certain things in which the modern programs still fail. Page turns, for example, tend to be not always musically intuitive, even if they fit the visual part of the score sometimes. Sometimes you have a page where everything is cramped, and then the next page, everything is really expanded, and that gets very difficult to read. It doesn't handle system breaks hardly well at all. Often, one of the biggest cases, and I beg your forgiveness here for a moment. My cat likes to chew the cords to the computer that connect the microphone and all that. This is a true Zoom call. We have cat intrusion here. The softwares do not always do a great job of knowing how much space is needed for the text, whether that be vertical space between the staff or horizontal space. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And it becomes the editor's job to manipulate those things manually, and it takes amount of time. Some things that the editor will do is flatten a slur, for example. You'll see, especially in alto lines, where the text, because the altos are more likely than any other part to have notes that are use ledger lines below the staff, which is where the text is. So sometimes you'll have a slur in an alto line, and then the text just gets moved really far down automatically, which makes it really difficult to see from that distance. So an editor can kind of flatten that curve of the slur slightly. The text can go up, and it's visible. A default setting for most of these programs is that the articulation, staccatos, legatos, tenutos, those kinds of marks, are generally on the same side as the note head. That's the traditional, which means if you have low notes for a while and then high notes and low notes and you jump around, it can be difficult to see intuitively where that articulation lies. You may have encountered that as well, in which case the editor can swap that, can move the articulation so they're all, say, at the top of the staff. That's usually what I do in a situation like that is changing. And I'll talk about nudging syllables and what that means in just a moment. These processes take time. Even after the notes are input into one of those programs, it can take hours and hours. And I do mean 20 and 30 hours for a medium-sized score just to deal with the formatting issues. Then you have to deal with those same issues of the vocal score, and it can take an almost comparable period of time. And far more if you are responsible for creating the piano reduction. That's a whole nother world. Instrumental parts. For a moderate length work, say half an hour, 40 minutes long, will take me at least about an hour or more of every one. So if that involves 20 different instruments, that's 20 different hours. And if you're lucky, they're all straightforward as that. Piano parts take longer, organ parts take even longer. For shorter work, it might not be quite as onerous. And that's because of those same issues that the software doesn't do well automatically, like page turns and system breaks, how many systems to have on a page, how cramped a page may be. So those are some of the questions that an editor has to take into mind, and that software cannot do for them. Now, that said, also there are certain, I love this topic, like language and like pretty much anything, social, cultural norms, music notation has evolved too. I'm not going to go into the details of how music notation evolved from the beginning. I'm just looking at editorial practices as they've evolved over the last 150 years or so. One is syllabic beaming. Traditionally, if you had a new syllable on a run of eighth notes or of 16th notes, each new syllable would be given a fresh flag rather than a beam. So, for example, this is an excerpt from Hubert Parry's I Was Glad. Let's look at this bass line. Oh, pray for the peace. It's visually so striking to me, it's different. So that line, that note, the notion of that descending scale easily just gets lost because of the visual element, the way in which the syllables are given these independent flags. Sometimes it can get really tricky when you have, here it was, Jerusalem, ooh, Salem, they shall. But this layout for a modern eye looks like there's some kind of syncopation going on. Jerusalem, they shall. We're just used to seeing things a little differently. So and that's all because the sa has its separate flag. It's accurate notation, but it's not intuitive notation for our eyes. So here's an example of another editor doing the first two bars of that. I didn't include the third bar because it was on a different page. This editor is me. That's actually a full score for a reorchestration I made some years ago. And you'll notice this pray for the, yes, there's no longer a slur, there isn't a slur linking them, but it's so much more intuitive to see these four notes in one steady line, because this beam looks like it's one steady line. You could beam those together. That's, some people do that in tradition. I separate it by the beat. Likewise, here's the same thing here. This notion for the piece, when you have the dot and the smaller beam, it makes it so much simpler to intuit the rhythm. You can tell this is one beat, this is one beat, this is one beat, this is one beat. Whereas this tenor line, yes, it's clear, but again, not necessarily intuitive the first time you see it. So some advice I can give you then is actually to write in beams here, or write in a full slur to counteract that act. I would definitely put an extra beam here if I were reading that score, just so that I don't have to think about what's going on the next time I read it. Sometimes, as a ringer, as a chorister, I'm brought in with maybe one rehearsal and then a concert, so I need to see these things right away and make those changes in pencil in my score. And you can do the same in yours. Similar to syllabic beaming, there's these sort of syllabic slurs. So in this case, here we have this pray. When it's one syllable, it's slurred together. And then another example of ruhu. I often avoid doing that, but it requires very close attention to the underlay. Here is an example of that in this piece where I did not do a good job of it in this edition, is I did not notice that my word piece and my word of had run together. I should have manually shifted this piece over, ideally so that it was directly above the basses. But the program I was using didn't catch the fact that those two were too close to be read logically. Yes, so nowadays, quite often, or it's not uncommon at all for editions to leave out those slurs for one syllable if they can make it very clear what's happening. For example, there's an end of the line. They might have all of the notes and then just an extension, a word extension, like you see down here, to indicate that it's all of those notes that are above it. Now, that said, I brought this example in for a different issue. Again, it's relatively rarely encountered these days to have two different languages on the same vocal score. When I say it's rare, I should say it's rare for new editions to be created along those lines, but we still have to deal with them. This example is from my friend Barber's Prayers of Kierkegaard. What an absolute mess is this measure. I have prepared a chorus to sing this, and I cannot tell you how difficult it was to sing this measure when all it is, if you're singing in English, is dotted quarter note, jog quarter and then eighth, 2/8, eighth, and then tied to there. That's all it is. It's a rhythm we've all done millions of times, maybe literally before. But because they had to throw in all these German syllables, with the stems going downward, it makes it visually much more difficult. So again, if you see this, I have particular pieces of advice for you. One is to just get whiteout or tape or black ink or something and just scratch out the language you're not going to use. But you still have these flags and stems. In this case, I would put a big X over that flag and cross out and big X's over these bottom flags, just so that all you're thinking of, oh, and you have to cross out this note entirely, so that all you're thinking of, ideally, is those things with the stems going up, because that's the English. It's a matter of writing it in the score and taking your own responsibility to say if it's something that's tricky for you, that you have the power to fix that. Empowered singers, hey. The last example I'll give here about evolving norms is that of the C clef. Once upon a time, sopranos, altos, and tenors often were given the C clef. I didn't put an example for what it looks like. That's because if you ever have to work with a score that's in C clefs, it's proof that your conductor does not like you. There's no reason to use C clefs these days. There, I've said it. Well, no, the one reason is if you're a viola. That's it. That's it. The end. So the way those work is that there's a little thing in the middle of the C clef that indicates where middle C is. And nobody wants to have to calculate all that. We're used to different things. So when an editor sits down to create an edition, they have to take into account the various availability of source materials. Their primary, secondary, tertiary, and so forth, based on how close the source was to the composer themselves. And each of these kind of goes in order that I've listed here. The autograph is the term we use for the composer's own manuscript. It used to be called a holograph, but then technology has made it so that holograms and holographs are real things, so we tend to use the word autograph instead. But again, that term means it's the composer's hand. There are other manuscripts, of course, that are still primary sources that were written by a scribe or an assistant to the composer. Bach is a great example of this, where Bach will start writing something out, perhaps in his hand in his own manuscripts, and then he hands it over to a scribe, one of his students, to finish it out. Still Bach's music, but the scribe was working off of Bach's own original, which may make it a secondary score. There can be bleed over in these ideas. The facsimile would be a digital reproduction of the above. Nowadays, facsimiles are very, very good because we have scanning technology that works well. But sometimes the only surviving copy of an autograph is an older style photocopy or mimeograph or something like that, which may have extraneous dots and markings that were part of the reproduction process. Again, we don't have to deal with that issue much today, thank goodness. The very first edition is often a primary source because the composer may have had direct input, and the way in which that would have been managed is the composer sends their autograph, their manuscript, to the publisher. The publisher would have engraved it back in the olden days. Then the publisher sends a proof copy back to the composer. So the composer saying this is what the score will look like if we publish it right away. The composer then goes through it and makes their own changes and sends that back to the publisher. You may have another round of proofs, in fact, and only then will it get published. Sometimes other early editions also had the influence of the composer. I remember many years ago, I was in grad school, doing a project about Brahms' Magalone Lieder, which is for not for chorus, but for solo voice. And we went through several different of these early sources, the autograph, another copy, the first edition, the proofs that were sent, and some of Brahms's marks from the proofs did not make it to the first edition. Then there was a later edition that Brahms seems to have had some input in, and things like that. I think there were 5 or 6 different sources, and my job was to go through and mark the differences between each of these. And I kid you not, there were times where a particular thing would have been different in every one of the 5 or 6 scores. There was one slur I remember in particular, and sometimes it was the start of the slur or the end of the slur and how it behaved, which has an effect of how you sing it. Then since then, there are other secondary sources, other people's manuscripts, different types of scores. Sometimes the instrumental parts themselves of an early edition are all that survives. Which one? One of the Diaghilev ballets, I think. There's no manuscript for it, but the earliest version we have is of the parts. So this brings out certain challenges, and I'm going to bring 3 examples from the composer William Walton, who, as many of you know, if you know me at least, is dear to my heart. And I'm going to bring up these 3 particular examples of challenges that a modern editor faces. Here is, as I've shown, the score to Belshazzar's Feast. It's a new critical edition. I'll talk about what critical editions are in a moment. The autograph, the composer's own manuscript, has been missing for a long time. So when you're making a new edition of this, you don't have that original resource. The only thing in Walton's hand is 3 pages that he wrote of a revised version later on. Isn't that great? You get 3 pages. So what modern editors use are things, in this case, they use the following: 3 different copyists' scores from early on in his publishing history, the 3 printed scores that Walton himself used as a conductor. So he had his own markings in there. Of course, they do not agree all the time. There was a manuscript that was made by, I think it was Roy Douglas, who was a very trusted friend and copyist of Walton and other British composers at that time. We have the original set of instrumental parts and the original 3 editions, the study score, the full score, and the vocal score. And a modern editor, in this case, has to take all of those sources and from them create something new that's actually usable and isn't just a jumble. So sometimes you only have 1 source, sometimes you have an abundance of sources, sometimes you have an abundance of sources, but not the one source you really, really want, like that autograph. The other case is some sources may disagree. There's a huge issue in Handel's Messiah, which I'll talk about a little later in one specific example. If you've ever gone to a Messiah sing-along and brought your own Novello score while the person next to you had a G. Schirmer score, you sang different words at some times, you sang different rhythms at some times. Which one is right is a whole nother matter and depends on your definition of right. The other example I want to bring in for Walton and the issue of scores may disagree is his earliest surviving work, which is a choral piece called A Litany. There are 3 versions of it. The first 2 he wrote within a few months of each other, and the third does not exist in any manuscript, but in the printed version, which came out 15 years later. And there are dozens of differences. I've listed these things. I'm astonished. It's wonderful, and usually it's all to the better as he refined his technique. There's a modern edition. The modern edition, though, incorporates some markings from the first and second versions into their new version of the third version. I'm not convinced that Walton would have wanted that. I think he was conscientious enough from his editions of the time that he would have put things in that he wanted in, and some things he removed. So I actually prefer the older version of that, of a litany, I should say more accurately, the older edition of the third version, which is the final version that Walton wrote. But now all that's available is that new edition that was made that has these changes. So sources disagree, and it's up to the editor to make a decision. And I'm incredibly respectful of that editor. They did a fantastic job of so much in there. So it's interesting how two people can just disagree on how to interpret the available evidence. Then a very crucial issue that sometimes you only have one source and it itself will be unclear. So there's a short song for two vocalists and a small chamber group by Walton called "Tell Me Where's Fancy Bread." It's another very, very early work. He was a teenager. And in several instances, the notation itself is imprecise. For example, there's one on one page, there's a good flat symbol, which doesn't quite look like all the other flats. It's different in some way. And it doesn't look like somebody else just came along and put a flat in either. So I'm convinced it's a smudge. In fact, if you look at it, on the opposite side, it looks like there's a quarter note that could have just smudged right onto it. If you have the mirror image of the quarter note may look like the mirror image of the flat. And so they just got pressed together, and huzzah, now we have complexities for an editor to solve. Scott, there are questions.
Questions. There are several, and they're very good.
Oh boy, I'll try to be quick.
Pick them up in the reverse order in which they have been asked. This person had sung Honegger with Choral. I remember that getting the Honegger was a challenge. Does the popularity of a piece of music have a relationship with how accessible the versions are? That's a great question.
Absolutely. If the work is done a lot more often, then the publisher is willing to put more money into higher quality scores or making new editions or making piano vocal scores, when originally all they had was choral parts. The choral parts is mostly French and German publishers who use that. You won't find very many English works, for example. Yeah.
Can you figure out what the music will sound like by looking at the page, or do you need to hear it?
If by you mean me singular, it's a mix of both. But if you mean in general,
I think that this is a question about audiation, I think, is what this comes down to.
Yeah, and it's different people have different skills. Thomas Banks Strong, while we're on the subject of Walton, who's one of Walton's adults in his life, he could sit down with a full score of music and just hear it in his head, whether he had heard it before necessarily or not. His idea is some people sit down with a good book. He would sit down with a good Wagner score and just read Wagner for a while. So some people have that ability more than others, I guess is the best way to phrase that.
It's a skill that can be developed, I think. I think audiation can be taught, maybe not to the advanced level that some orchestral conductors enjoy. There are some innate ability to it, but it has to be pointed out. It has to be developed. It has to be, I think it has to be taught from a young age in order to be really, really developed as an adult. At least that's been my experience as a teacher of voice, choral and voice teacher. The other question here is wondering on average how much time you spend going through the music before we even start rehearsing.
Again, that will vary from every conductor or singer, what have you. In my particular case, if it's a piece that I have conducted in the past, I tend to trust my memory, for better or worse. I'll go through it and say, okay, I remember how this goes, and bring it to the first rehearsal with that. Part of that is because I know over the course of rehearsals, I will get to know it better. If it's a brand new piece, then I sometimes will sit at a piano for hours, making sure I know all the counterpoints and so on and so forth. So it varies. I don't have an incredibly advanced ability of audiation like Scott was talking about. I can go to the piano. There have been pieces that I have myself, I've been given by a composer, and I've plugged it into the computer as an editor, and just to make sure I was getting it right. How much time though it can vary. This coming up in January, as choirs are starting to become more active, there are pieces of music that I will look at a lot, and there are pieces I will basically ignore and bring to the first rehearsal because I've done them so many times. Sooner Will Be Done. I'm doing the William Dawson Sooner Will Be Done Away to Troubles of the World. I can do that one. It's not a problem. So anyway, that's the answer for me, at least. And again, it'll vary from conductor to conductor. The great Robert Shaw, he used to restudy the score from scratch every time he did a piece. So when he was doing the Brahms Requiem again, which he had done who knows how many dozens of times, he would get a new full score, start over from the beginning, and not even look at his old stuff. I'm not that good. Or something.
Actually buy a facsimile of Shaw's marked up score for the Brahms Requiem. It's an interesting thing to
But
behold.
which version? He redid it every time. So
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
another editorial decision in play.
One more question here, and then I think we need to get back to the last part of the presentation.
Yeah.
What editorial considerations are encountered when transposing from one key signature to another?
Wow, what a great question.
Also a great question. And yeah.
So I'm going to take this from the point of view of a score that has already been an input into the computer, because it is different when you're doing it by hand. The editor needs to be very careful. There will be accidentals that will shift, things that will suddenly become double sharps, which actually in the harmony are just naturals of, you might see a B double sharp when in harmonically it's just a C natural, but the computer doesn't know that. So the editor has to apply their own knowledge of harmony. Pending how far you're transposing it, if it's quite a distance, you might find your text is suddenly in a different location on a particular page, or your articulations are now askew. So it's not as hard as making a whole new vocal score, for example, but it takes a lot more time than you'd think. You can't just press a button and have it done.
Well, Gary, that their transposition can result in out of range errors.
Yeah.
If you transpose too high or too low, the tessitura changes, and there are often, I think, simple transpositions often require revoicing because the counterpoint stops working at that pitch usually for the interior voices.
Yeah. I was thinking of those as musical issues rather than editorial, but you're exactly right that I'm thinking now of Renaissance editions that I've made, and in composers like Josquin, where you have an SATB choir, and then you have this music that was essentially written for ATTB, and you try to transpose things around in the futile hope that the altos will be happy singing in their low range, or tenors will be happy singing the occasional top A more often than they would like.
The first time I was trapped in an elevator with Morton Lauritsen, the 30 seconds going from the ground floor of the artist entrance there at Benaroya to the hall were talking about the difficulties of transposing O Magnum Mysterium from SATB to TTBB, because his signature his tonal signature had to be revoiced in order to work for male voices. So there are some pretty complex considerations, I think, in transposition.
I would say in that case, at least, it's not an act of transposition; it's an act of arranging.
Yeah.
Because many changes have to be made. You're used to having, the low G range, say, to a high G range, and then suddenly you only have this number of notes available to you when you don't have sopranos and altos. That's arrangement, and it's very challenging.
All right, Gary, I think we're ready for the next section.
So I'll zip through some things here. There is a, oh, no, my thing is, I clicked to something at some point. There we go. There are all different kinds of editors. They all have their value. There are seasoned musicologists who've been doing this for decades. Sometimes the engraver within a publisher or just a freelance might be also undertaking the role of editor. We still use the term engraver, by the way, even though it's just for digital purposes. Sometimes, and this is where I fit in, the professional performer who just needs an edition. If I go somewhere and I cannot find an edition that I like, I make my own. It's also a quick, easy way for grad students sometimes to make a buck as a freelance engraver. And then you get these enthusiastic hobbyists, some of whom are fantastic. So when I say hobbyist, know that I do not mean it in any kind of diminutive form. The great editor of Haydn, H.C. Robbins Landon, was a hobbyist. He was independently wealthy, so he could just do this and didn't need to do it for a living. And there's just wonderful editions back then. And often these different types of editors will have different goals as they're making it. And I'm going to talk about different aspects of scholarship, going from the most purist to a bit more of an extrapolatory. Is that a word? Fun. We have the fancy German word of Urtext, say we can call it the quintessential text, which generally means it is the autograph manuscript, composer's own writings, pure, unsullied, just put into a computer. The theory being that those editions remove the editor entirely from the process. It's just the composer. However, deciding not to change things is still an editorial decision. There's still an act of imposition involved there. And those scores, or text scores, do leave things to the composer, or to the performer. Stravinsky famously said that nobody ever needed to add dynamics to his scores because he wrote it that way. You know, just play the note at that level and that's the dynamic, or play that particular note in that particular instrument and it'll come out the dynamic he wants. There's questions to say maybe Bach did the same, but then there's a whole other world of openings that I won't get into right now about Bach's instrumentalists and choristers and so on. There's a great example of this of the value and question of an urtext in Handel Messiah. In Hallelujah chorus, there's a spot near the big climax, and King of Kings and Lord of Lords, which we, especially tenors, know because we get those. But if you go back to the originals, it's actually King of Kings, and he shall reign to prepare us for, and he shall reign forever and ever. So, sometimes then someone will get that urtext edition that says, and he shall reign, and say, no, that's not how it's supposed to go. From later editions, Handel probably changed his mind for it. I get this particular example, by the way, from a blog called Settling Scores by Brooks Kirkendall, a fellow Walton scholar. And if you are enjoying these comparisons of different editions and such, I strongly encourage you to check out his blog, which has many examples of these things. It's fantastic. So the urtext, the quintessential, at its the most kernel raw example of scholarship. Next, we get the critical edition. So I've already showed to you, I think twice, the critical edition of Belshazzar's Feast. Fancy binding, very nice, very expensive. Here's one from Berlioz's critical edition as well. This is the works for chorus and solo instrument. Have you ever sung any of these? Probably not, but they're here and they're cool. I'll bring another example, my last one. And this is not part of a complete works of a composer, like a critical edition usually is. These are the anthems by a fellow named John Goss, who's a mid-19th century English church composer. Hefty tome. Putting these here so the cat who's sitting right here won't eat them. So in these score editions, a critical edition, usually only a musicologist, a trained, seasoned musicologist will undertake these. They compare all of the primary sources that survive and any relevant secondary sources, anything that has material that might be useful, and compares those and makes a decision. Usually these will include indications of, sometimes, They include indications of things that they've added that might have been in one source, but not in their usual source or not in any primary source, but they believe should be there. And usually they'll do so by indicating that. So if you see a slur that's a dotted line rather than a steady line, it means the editor decided that it should be there, even though in their main source it wasn't. Sometimes you'll see dynamics in an upright font rather than the traditional italics. The text might be italicized. That's a sure sign that the editor is the one who decided which syllable went under which note. You'll find things in brackets, sometimes even pitches themselves. Basically, this is the editor showing what isn't in their main source. It's not them showing off that they did something, though sometimes it looks like it, but they're being responsible about how they treat the original documents. In one of those big fancy critical editions, there'll be a list at the beginning that shows all the different decisions, changes, discrepancies between the sources. But in the more affordable versions, that list won't be there, which means since your conductor probably only has that affordable version, they may not even be aware of some of the scholarship that went into it. And so they may ask you to change your scores to adhere to the more traditional "and Lord of Lords" rather than "and he shall reign." And that's okay too. It can still be a brilliant musical experience. Moving slightly into the notion of perhaps less scholarship sometimes, or again, different limits of scholarship, are your common performing editions that are usually what we as singers encounter. Some of them are kind of critically informed. They're almost the level of a critical edition. Bärenreiter is usually good about this. Oxford University Press, they're fantastic. John Rutter is really doing fantastic work as an editor in particular, not just as a composer. And his editions are usually the ones that I pick when I buy 6 or 7 different editions to decide which one we're going to use. And then there are those that are less critically informed. There are publishers that are very useful publishers like Dover and Calmus, who simply reprint 19th century scores. They don't really do any adaptations to it. They reprint them. So those are sometimes very good scores, especially if they came from a publisher like Breitkopf and Hertel. But there's not a lot of critical attention goes into creating it. So particularly in scores like that, you may find the conductor making changes again to add more modern scholarship if they're aware of that or how that works. I remember a few years ago when I conducted all 6 Bach motets, and I did a really solid comparison of the Karras edition and the Bärenreiter edition to find the discrepancies. And I don't even remember now to this day which one we used, but I remember making slight changes because I thought it was more musical or more in accordance with the original. Let me give you some examples here. The Fauré Requiem is a wonderful example of the value of performing editions and how they change. I'm citing here 5 different editions, all of which are great. They all serve their purpose. The 1965 Calmus, which for a long time was the standard, that was just a reprint of the original that came out in 1900. Here's this 1975 G. Schirmer, which is still, I think, the most common in use. It had a new piano reduction. It's clearer to read than that Calmus, and it rightly became the gold standard. When John Rutter started doing his editions in earnest, he had this published through Hinshaw, an American publisher, in 1984, and his purpose was to do the original or early version. And there are good reasons to do that. The orchestration that Fauré allegedly made was probably not made by him at all. There are certain things that are just decisions that are made in it that are sloppy. Things like there's one instrument, I think it's a second bassoon or bass clarinet, something that is used in only 7 measures. So a more conscientious composer like Fauré wouldn't have made a decision that would be so expensive. It was either his student Jean-Roger Ducasse or perhaps an editor in-house in Hamel who made that orchestration. But now there's a new generation of Fauré Requiem scores. Here's Bärenreiter. It claims to be an Urtext. and it's of that orchestrated version. And Karos, which also is an urtext of sorts for that early version. I think I've most recently used the Baron writer, I think. But in any case, there are real factual or real differences between them. Notes that are different. There's one point where the tenors come in, and whether or not they sing the first note or two is different in these different editions. It's real stuff. It's audible stuff. Different types of scholarship, and they all have their virtues. There are also public domain forums with free scores, which I've used often. Sometimes you hear them maligned. I think that's unjust. The Choral Public Domain Library, CPDL. Many of my editions are on CPDL. They're new ones, usually made by performers and hobbyists. Yes, the quality varies, but you get to find them and make your own decisions. IMSLP, the Internet Music Score Library Project, is more scans of public domain editions. And they even calculate the year of copyright to let you know whether it's safe for you to download it, which is different in the US or the UK or the EU or Canada, and it comments on that. Thank goodness. Now, these scores are varying reliability. You'll get those early 4A scores, but none of the more recent, more research scores. And some of the scans are not very clear to read. Just in the last couple of years, they're starting to add more CPDL-style new editions, particularly of large works with orchestra and chorus, and they tend to be all right. Sources to know about that your conductor and board may have chosen to get the editions from that. I want to close with two special examples of historical note. One is in making editions of the Renaissance. I'm kind of listing 5 categories. You get these, believe it or not, people didn't really sing much Renaissance music until around the 1920s. I mean, between the Renaissance and the 1920s. Some pieces in some venues, yes, but it wasn't generally done. And then after the Second World War, in the 50s in particular, these pieces started getting performed more and more, but people didn't know how to perform them, how to make them musical. So editors added dynamics and shifted the words around. They modernized the notation to help singers to learn how to sing Renaissance music. Now, that said, some of them were more invasive than others, but again, that was their intent, and those do have some use. But since the 1980s and thereafter, there are more critically informed performing scores that have modern bar lines and modern meters, modern note values, modern spelling of text, but they won't include things like dynamics and phrasing. They look very sparse. They look just like notes and text, and that's it. So it's kind of the opposite extreme of those 1950s style scores. And I'm about to tell you the secret trick. All you need to ever know about Renaissance phrasing and dynamics, more or less 80% of the time, 85% of the time. Crescendo to a stressed syllable and diminuendo away from it. You have to know a little Latin in sacred music, true, but it's all about the syllabication. It's all about the text. And number 2, crescendo to the high notes and diminuendo away, similar to the Stravinsky philosophy. They wrote it at the dynamic level they wanted it. But now we have enough vocal training in choirs. We know how to sing high notes soft and low notes loud if we need to. That's it. Those are your 2 tricks. Congratulations. If I ever do a lecture on how to do Renaissance music, that's all it's going to say is those 2. No, that's not true. There'll be more. There are also critical editions that do not include bar lines or dynamics, but they also have old style text spellings, the old note values. What we think of as the quarter note is usually the standard value. Back then it was the half note or the open, it would be open rather than filled in, partly because ink was expensive. Instead of meters or time signatures, they use what are called mensuration symbols. I'm not going to get into that, but it's something different than meter. These days, there's some editors and performers who like singing from individual parts. That's just their line, like a long time ago I talked about orchestra use, but they'll slightly modernize it. It'll look clean. It'll look with modern quarters and halves and things like that. But if you really want to be a purist, and I don't know many people who do this these days, but they exist, they'll reproduce something like this. And it may not be the pagination or the sister breaks. This is from William Byrd's Mass for Four Voices. It's the original edition from the 1590s, which I got from IMSLP. This is the Kyrie for the soprano part only. There's a big k, isn't that nice? Kyrie eleison, and you kind of figure out where the pitches go. Then there's just this IJ, which evolved, or so I'm led to believe, from just the Roman numeral 2, II, but they wrote as IJ to be a little clearer, which means repeat the text, do the text a second time. Well, there are a whole lot of notes here to sing Kyrie eleison, and it's up to the performer to decide where each of those syllables will lie. Sometimes it's easy. This Christe eleison, this Christe eleison, it's just syllabic. But here you have to make real decisions. It's fun singing off of these. Yeah, it's a good time. Recommended for everybody to have that experience at least once in their lives. The second special case are modern composers who publish their own works. I doff my hat to them. Composers these days are expected to be their own marketing department, their own editing department, and it's really unfortunate because I think that because of that, there are composers who are wonderful, whose music we just don't know because they're not very good marketers or editors, and it can go the other way around, of course. Even composers who write out by hand, nowadays it's expected that they'll type it into Finale or Sibelius or Dorico, one of the programs that are used. They have certain challenges. They are unlikely to be familiar with my friend behind bars or something like it. Sometimes composers learned as an instrumentalist, as a string player or piano in particular, and they're just not familiar with certain vocal oddities. I've sung in many recordings of film trailers, the soundtrack to film trailers. And I tell you, those composers clearly had never sung in a choir. But there are many of them. For example, they would in order to make the text clearer, they thought, as one composer had told me, they used all capital letters. It's easier to read, it's bigger, right? But our brains aren't wired that way. There was one who would, or the syllabication would be off. They usually used Latin words that they just kind of used that had nothing to do with the music, like re, and then the next syllable would look like quia, and the next pitch would have when they clearly meant re, qui, em, but they just thought it was re, qui, em. They're saying the letter M, perhaps. So they just don't know these things, and this hasn't been in their experience. So it's a different kind of challenge. Sometimes too, composer scores, I know some wonderful composers these days who I can perform regularly. Their scores are rather small in font. It's kind of tricky to see, and it's logical. It's because they, as the composer, when they're composing, they need to see the whole thing very clearly. But when you're singing, you need to see your line most clearly, and then everything else is there also. So it takes a larger font for the singer. But the composer, since they're used to seeing it as the whole, they think they can see it larger, or in their mind they can see every line clearly as well, because they're not sight reading it the first time. Often the only recommendation there is to enlarge it, or to sing it the first time like this, and they get a little further away each time, perhaps. There is good news, though, about self-composed, self-published composers. The best news being that the music is available at all. Many of these composers, there are many established composers that got their start doing self-publishing in order to get their name out there, and now they are out there. So the standard publishing houses no longer have the sole decision-making process of what music is available. You'll also find those scores are very unlikely to have wrong notes because composers will use the playback just to check that they typed it in right. And they typically have very keen ears about that. Sometimes the scores are available for free, or you can see them as a perusal score. You can see all the notes without needing to to order one specifically. And if you're really lucky, then you can just they'll send something to you as a PDF, and then you can pay for a license to print it at home. Now that said, established publishers aren't perfect either. I'm saying these problems of self-publish. One composer friend recently told me of a piece that they had accepted by a prominent publisher here in the States. And when the score came back for one of those proof copies I mentioned, it was filled with dozens, as he said it, of added dynamics and articulation marks. This composer is no slouch. He uses these dynamics, but now there are tons more, to the point where he actually went back to the publisher and said, I'm sorry, I have to pull this piece out of publication because it's no longer what I wrote. They negotiated things out and made it work, but so let us not say that all publishers are perfect or that all self-publishers are imperfect. If anything, I hope I've conveyed through this that there is a value to all these different kinds of editions. It's just a matter of the conductor choosing which ones fit the needs at the moment, and then also how the singers then get to go about interpreting that into music and making it beautiful. That's the purpose, after all. Do we have other questions? I know I'm way over time. Yay.
We've had one other question, Gary, and it has to do with identifying stressed syllables.
Yeah.
And how we identify stressed syllables looking at the score.
You'll need to know some of the basics of the language, some of the basics, not all of the intricacies. Even in English, sometimes it's tricky. In Latin, it's usually, or Italian, usually the penultimate syllable, but sometimes you'll have more than one, like incarnatus est, incarnatus est, incarnatus would be the one word there. Any word that has more than two or more syllables will have one of them will have an accent, even if it's just illud. And again, it's usually the penultimate. Exceptions to that, usually your conductor can tell you. If you, sing it, be bold, be brave. In French Latin, though, for example, the French don't really have any accented syllables in French necessarily when they speak it. So you like Poula and Gloria, for example, I'm trying to think of a good Gloria in excelsis Deo, excelsis in excelsis Deo. It's the X and the cis are musically accented, and there's no point in trying to make the choir sing in excelsis Deo and in these offbeats, which will then be against what the orchestra does, won't be as organic. Poulenc isn't that kind of a jaunty composer. So yes, how do you know it? You learn the language, and it's okay to know a little bit of the language and take a risk and go for it. That's my recommendation, at least.
Well, Gary, thank you for another wonderful in-depth look at what you know and do.
I think great. The word in-depth should be too long, right? No, I'm kidding. I just thank you very much, Scott.
I mean, you do not leave a lot undiscovered and leave enough for us to ask about. And so thank you for your deeply considered content as always. We are currently making plans for the fourth, is that right? Fourth semester. Are we on 4? We're on 4.
Yeah, we just finished 3.
Yeah, we just finished 3. So we're making plans for the 4th semester of the Emerald Choral Academy. We have just confirmed Holly Boaz will be returning to present a course on classical versus pop or musical theater singing styles. Gary will be teaching a course on how to follow different kinds of conducting styles. I will be continuing my series on the voice with a session on developing vocal resilience. We're also planning for IPA 102, the consonants, and Vocal Anatomy 104, the larynx. We hope to include a session on Alexander technique as well in the coming semester. We'll post more information about those sessions and registration information right after the new year begins. To be sure that you receive those announcements, join our mailing list or check the listings at and those listings are in your chat at the top of the chat. We at the Emerald Ensemble are grateful for the enthusiasm of you, our audiences and supporters. As the Emerald Choral Academy continues, you can help support our efforts by donating at emeraldensemble.org. You can also let us know about topics that you would like to see discussed in the future. In the meantime, I'm Scott Kovacs, and on behalf of Gary and all the Emerald Ensemble, we wish you good physical, mental, and musical health. Thank you.